The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Windsor Castle as 9-year-old Princess Charlotte stood at her bedroom window, watching the familiar routine of the Royal Guard's morning inspection. She pressed her small hands against the cool glass, her breath creating tiny fog patches as she observed the soldiers in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, moving in perfect formation. Charlotte had always found comfort in this daily ritual. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, the guards would march across the cobblestones, their boots creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the ancient walls. Today felt different, though. There was something in the air that made her stomach feel uneasy, like the feeling she got before a thunderstorm. Her governess, Mrs. Thompson, knocked gently on the door before entering with a warm smile. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness. Are you ready for your history lesson?" she asked, carrying a stack of books and Charlotte's favorite lavender tea. Charlotte turned from the window, her long brown hair catching the morning light. "Mrs. Thompson, why do the guards always do the same thing every day? Don't they ever get tired of marching?" The elderly woman set down the tea and smoothed Charlotte's hair affectionately. "Tradition, my dear. Some things never change because they represent something bigger than ourselves. The Royal Guard has protected your family for hundreds of years. Their routine keeps everyone safe." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, though she didn't fully understand why safety required such rigid schedules. She had grown up surrounded by these traditions, from the formal dinners where she had to remember which fork to use, to the way she had to curtsy to certain relatives, even though they were just her aunts and uncles. As they settled into the morning lesson about British history, Charlotte found her mind wandering back to the window. She could still hear the guards outside, but something seemed off about their usual pattern. The marching sounded different, more urgent somehow. Mrs. Thompson was explaining the importance of the monarchy in British society when a commotion erupted from the courtyard below. Raised voices carried through the thick stone walls, followed by the sound of running footsteps on cobblestones. "What's happening?" Charlotte asked, jumping up from her chair and rushing back to the window. Mrs. Thompson joined her, both of them peering down at the scene unfolding below. The normally orderly formation of guards had broken apart. Some were running toward the main gate while others were speaking rapidly into their communication devices. Even from 3 stories up, Charlotte could see the tension in their movements. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, Princess," Mrs. Thompson said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Charlotte had never heard before. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. One of the castle's senior staff members entered quickly, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible stress. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to speak with you privately," he said, glancing meaningfully at Charlotte. Charlotte felt her heart begin to race. Adult conversations that excluded her usually meant something was wrong. She had learned to read the subtle signs, the way people's voices changed, how they looked at each other when they thought she wasn't watching. "I'll just be a moment, Charlotte," Mrs. Thompson said, stepping into the hallway with the staff member. Alone in her room, Charlotte pressed her ear to the door, trying to catch fragments of their hushed conversation. She could only make out a few words: security breach, immediate, and protocol. Each word sent a chill down her spine. When Mrs. Thompson returned, her face was pale, but she was trying to maintain her usual composure. "Charlotte, dear, we need to gather a few of your things. We're going to have a little adventure today." "What kind of adventure?" Charlotte asked, though the serious expression on her governess's face told her this wasn't the fun kind of adventure she had read about in her storybooks. "We're going to visit a different part of the castle, somewhere very safe and special. But we need to go right now." Charlotte's mind raced with questions, but something in Mrs. Thompson's tone told her that now wasn't the time for her usual curiosity. She quickly grabbed her favorite stuffed rabbit and followed her governess toward the door. As they stepped into the hallway, Charlotte noticed that the usual bustling activity of the castle had changed dramatically. Staff members were moving with purpose, but also with barely concealed anxiety. Some were carrying boxes and files, while others were speaking in urgent whispers. They walked quickly through corridors that Charlotte had known all her life, but everything felt different now. The familiar tapestries and paintings seemed to watch them as they passed, and the echo of their footsteps sounded louder than usual in the suddenly quiet halls. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlotte whispered as they turned down a corridor she had never seen before. "Are Mummy and Papa okay?" Mrs. Thompson squeezed her hand gently. Your parents are very busy taking care of important matters right now. They want to make sure you're somewhere safe while they handle everything. They descended a narrow stone staircase that Charlotte didn't know existed. The walls here were older, made of rough stone instead of the polished surfaces she was used to. Electric lights had been installed, but they cast strange shadows that danced as they walked. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a heavy wooden door with multiple locks. Mrs. Thompson produced a set of keys and began unlocking them one by one. Each click echoed in the narrow space, making Charlotte's anxiety grow stronger. "This is where we'll stay for a little while," Mrs. Thompson explained as the door swung open to reveal a comfortable but windowless room furnished with chairs, a small bed and shelves lined with books and games. Charlotte stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the softer lighting. The room was cozy, but the lack of windows made her feel trapped. She had never been anywhere in the castle without natural light before. "How long will we be here?" she asked, setting her stuffed rabbit on the bed. Mrs. Thompson was checking her phone with a worried expression. "I'm not sure, dear, but I promise everything will be all right. Why don't we read one of these lovely books while we wait?" But Charlotte couldn't focus on reading. Every sound from outside their hidden room made her jump. She kept thinking about the broken formation of guards, the urgent whispers in the corridors, and the fact that no one would tell her what was really happening. As the hours passed in their underground sanctuary, Charlotte began to realize that this wasn't just another royal protocol or security drill. Something had happened that was serious enough to shatter the careful routines that had governed her entire life. 3 hours had passed in the underground room, and Charlotte was growing more restless with each passing minute. Mrs. Thompson had tried to keep her occupied with books and quiet games, but nothing could distract her from the growing knot of worry in her stomach. The silence from the world above felt heavy and unnatural. Mrs. Thompson's phone buzzed constantly, but she would only read the messages with her back turned to Charlotte, her shoulders growing more tense with each update. Charlotte pretended to be absorbed in her coloring book, but she was actually watching every expression that crossed her governess's face. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlotte finally said, setting down her crayons, "I know something bad has happened. I'm not a baby anymore. Please tell me what's going on." The older woman looked at Charlotte for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "There's been a security situation at the castle, dear. Some people who shouldn't be here managed to get inside. The guards are handling it, but your safety is the most important thing right now." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "What kind of people? Are they trying to hurt us?" Before Mrs. Thompson could answer, they heard footsteps on the stone stairs outside their door. Heavy boots moving quickly but trying to be quiet. Mrs. Thompson immediately moved to stand between Charlotte and the door, her protective instincts taking over. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. A gentle knock followed, then a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Thompson, it's Commander Davies. I need to speak with you." Mrs. Thompson visibly relaxed at the sound of the Royal Guard commander's voice. She unlocked the door to find a tall man in military uniform, his face grave but reassuring. Charlotte had seen him before during official ceremonies, always standing at attention near her parents. "Commander, what's the situation?" Mrs. Thompson asked quietly. "We've contained the immediate threat, but we need to move the princess to a more secure location. There were more intruders than we initially realized, and some may still be unaccounted for." Charlotte stepped forward, her young voice surprisingly steady. "Commander Davies, where are my parents? Are they safe?" The commander looked down at her with respect, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Your Royal Highness, your parents are safe and being protected by our best teams. But right now we need to focus on keeping you safe too." "I want to see them," Charlotte said, her bottom lip beginning to tremble despite her efforts to appear brave. "I understand, Princess, but that's not possible right now. We're going to take you somewhere even safer, and hopefully, you'll be reunited with your family very soon." Mrs. Thompson gathered Charlotte's few belongings while Commander Davies spoke quietly into his radio. Charlotte caught fragments of his conversation. "Package secure, route clear, and transport. Standing by." The military language made everything feel more real and more frightening. They left the underground room and climbed a different set of stairs than the ones they had descended earlier. These led to a part of the castle Charlotte had never seen before, with narrow corridors and lower ceilings. The walls here were painted plain white instead of being covered with the rich tapestries she was used to. "Where are we going?" Charlotte asked as they walked quickly through the unfamiliar passages. To a safe house, Commander Davies replied. It's a special place where members of your family can stay when the main castle isn't secure. They emerged through a hidden door that looked like part of the wall from the outside. Charlotte found herself in a small courtyard she had never known existed, surrounded by high walls and completely hidden from view. A plain black car was waiting with its engine running. As they approached the vehicle, Charlotte suddenly stopped walking. The reality of leaving the only home she had ever known hit her like a physical blow. "I don't want to go," she said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "This is my home. Why can't the guards just make the bad people leave?" Commander Davies knelt down to her level, his stern military bearing softening as he looked into her frightened eyes. "Princess, sometimes protecting what we love means making difficult choices. Your castle will still be here when you return, but right now, the most important thing is keeping you safe." Charlotte wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself the way she had been taught. Royal children weren't supposed to cry in front of others, but she was finding it impossible to hold back her tears. Mrs. Thompson helped her into the car, and Charlotte was surprised to find it looked completely ordinary inside. She had expected something official and intimidating, but it felt more like riding in a regular family car. Commander Davies sat in the front passenger seat while Mrs. Thompson sat beside Charlotte in the back. As they drove through unfamiliar streets, Charlotte pressed her face to the window, watching her world change with each mile. They passed through small villages she had only seen in picture books, with thatched roof cottages and gardens full of flowers. Under different circumstances, she would have found it all quite lovely. "How long will we have to stay away?" she asked Mrs. Thompson. "I don't know exactly, dear, but I promise you'll be comfortable and I'll stay with you the whole time." They drove for nearly 2 hours, the landscape gradually changing from villages to countryside and finally, to a more remote area with rolling hills and thick forests. Charlotte had dozed off against Mrs. Thompson's shoulder, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day. She woke as the car turned down a long, tree-lined driveway. At the end was a beautiful but modest country house, much smaller than the castle but somehow more welcoming. It had large windows that let in plenty of natural light, and a garden that looked like it had grown wild and free. "This is Meadowbrook House," Commander Davies explained as they got out of the car. "It's been in royal care for many years, used exactly for situations like this." A woman in her 50s came out to greet them, wiping her hands on a kitchen apron. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately made Charlotte feel less anxious. "You must be Princess Charlotte," she said, with a gentle curtsy. "I'm Mrs. Baker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay. I hope you like apple pie because I just pulled one from the oven." For the first time since the morning, Charlotte managed a small smile. The normalcy of someone offering her pie felt like a lifeline in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty. As they walked toward the house, Charlotte looked back once at the car that had brought them here. Commander Davies was already speaking into his radio again, probably coordinating with the teams back at the castle. She realized that while this house might be safer, she was now further away from her parents than she had ever been in her life. The weight of that distance settled in her chest as Mrs. Baker led them inside, where the warm smell of baking and the cozy furniture couldn't quite chase away the fear that everything familiar had been left behind. The first night at Meadowbrook House was the longest of Charlotte's young life. Despite Mrs. Baker's kindness and the cozy bedroom she had been given, sleep came in fragments interrupted by strange dreams and unfamiliar sounds. Every creak of the old house made her heart race, wondering if the bad people had somehow found them. When morning finally came, Charlotte woke to sunlight streaming through curtains covered in tiny painted flowers. For a moment, she forgot where she was and expected to see the familiar view of the castle grounds from her window. Instead, she saw rolling meadows dotted with sheep and a small pond reflecting the early morning sky. Mrs. Baker knocked softly and entered with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness. I thought you might like to eat in your room this morning, but later we could have lunch in the garden if you'd like." Charlotte sat up in the unfamiliar bed, her hair tangled from a restless night. "Mrs. Baker, have you heard anything about my parents?"
Do you know when I can go home?
The housekeeper's expression grew gentle but careful. "I'm afraid I don't have that information, dear. But Mrs. Thompson will be able to tell you more when she wakes up. She was on the phone quite late last night." After breakfast, Charlotte wandered through the house, exploring her temporary new world. Meadowbrook House was nothing like the castle, but it had its own charm. The rooms were smaller and filled with comfortable furniture that looked like it was meant to be used rather than admired. There were bookshelves everywhere, filled with novels and poetry rather than the historical texts and formal biographies that lined the castle library. In the sitting room, she found Mrs. Thompson speaking quietly on her mobile phone by the window. Charlotte tried not to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help catching fragments of the conversation. No, she doesn't know the full extent. Yes, I understand the sensitivity. How much longer do you estimate? When Mrs. Thompson noticed Charlotte listening, she quickly ended the call and turned with a forced smile. Good morning, Princess. Did you sleep well? Charlotte shook her head. Mrs. Thompson, please tell me what's really happening. I heard you talking about sensitivity and estimates. How bad is it? Mrs. Thompson sighed deeply and gestured for Charlotte to sit beside her on the window seat. For the first time since this ordeal began, she seemed to be considering telling Charlotte the complete truth. There was an incident at the castle yesterday morning, she began carefully. Some people who oppose the monarchy managed to get inside. They didn't hurt anyone, but they caused quite a disturbance. Your parents are safe, but the security team needs time to make sure something like this never happens again. Charlotte felt her stomach drop. People who oppose the monarchy? You mean they don't want us to be royal anymore? Some people have different ideas about how the country should be run, Mrs. Thompson explained. Most people respect and support your family, but a small group decided to make a statement by entering the castle uninvited. What kind of statement? Charlotte asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Thompson hesitated. They wanted to show that even the most protected places aren't completely secure. They were trying to prove a point about privilege and access. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She had always known that being royal made her different, but she had never really thought about people who might resent that difference. The idea that strangers disliked her family enough to break into their home was frightening and confusing. Are we going to be safe here? She asked in a small voice. Absolutely, Mrs. Thompson assured her. Commander Davies has people watching this house even though you can't see them, and the people who caused the trouble at the castle have been arrested. But Charlotte's sense of security had been fundamentally shaken. For the first time in her life, she understood that being a princess wasn't just about pretty dresses and state dinners. It also meant that some people saw her as a symbol of something they wanted to destroy. That afternoon, Mrs. Baker suggested they take a walk through the countryside around the house. Charlotte was hesitant to leave the safety of the building, but the sunshine and fresh air beckoned to her after being cooped up for so long. They walked along a narrow path that wound through fields of wildflowers. Mrs. Baker pointed out different birds and plants, her knowledge of the countryside impressive and soothing. For brief moments, Charlotte could almost forget why they were there. Mrs. Baker? Charlotte asked as they paused beside a stream. Have you taken care of other royal family members before? Once or twice over the years, Mrs. Baker replied. Usually just for short visits, though. This situation is a bit more unusual. Were they scared too? Mrs. Baker looked at Charlotte with understanding eyes. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Princess. It means you keep going even when you are scared, and you're being very brave. As they walked back toward the house, Charlotte saw a man in casual clothes working in the garden who hadn't been there that morning. When he noticed her looking, he nodded politely but didn't approach. Charlotte realized he was probably one of the security people Mrs. Thompson had mentioned. That evening, Charlotte found herself crying again as she got ready for bed. The tears seemed to come from nowhere, triggered by the simple act of brushing her teeth with a toothbrush that wasn't her own in a bathroom that smelled different from home. Mrs. Thompson found her sobbing into her pillow and sat on the edge of the bed, gently rubbing her back. It's all right to cry, Charlotte. This is a lot for anyone to handle, especially someone your age. I just want everything to go back to normal, Charlotte hiccuped. I want to see Mummy and Papa, and I want the guards to do their morning march like they always do. I know, dear, and someday soon things will feel normal again. But sometimes normal has to change a little bit to keep everyone safe. Charlotte turned over to look at her governess. Mrs. Thompson, will people always hate us for being royal? The question was so profound and sad that Mrs. Thompson had to take a moment before answering. Most people don't hate your family, Charlotte. Many people love and respect what the royal family represents. But in any country, there will always be people who disagree with how things are done. That's not necessarily bad, it's part of living in a democracy. But why did they have to come to our home? Sometimes when people feel very strongly about something, they make poor choices about how to express those feelings. Breaking into the castle was wrong, no matter what they believed. Charlotte curled up under the unfamiliar blankets, holding her stuffed rabbit tightly. Through the open window, she could hear night sounds that were completely different from the castle. Owls hooting, branches rustling in the wind, and the distant sound of sheep moving in the fields. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Charlotte wondered if this was what normal children felt like every night, falling asleep in houses without guards and protocols, surrounded by the simple sounds of the countryside rather than the weight of centuries of tradition. For the first time, she wasn't sure which felt safer. By the third day at Meadowbrook House, Charlotte had settled into a routine that felt both strange and oddly comforting. She woke without the sound of the Royal Guard's morning inspection, ate breakfast at a simple wooden table instead of in a formal dining room, and spent her afternoons exploring the countryside with Mrs. Baker, rather than attending protocol lessons. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, Charlotte's anxiety continued to grow. Each day that passed without word from her parents felt like proof that something was more seriously wrong than anyone was telling her. She had started to notice the way Mrs. Thompson's phone conversations became more hushed when she entered a room, and how Mrs. Baker sometimes looked worried when she thought Charlotte wasn't watching. On this particular morning, Charlotte decided she needed answers. She had always been a naturally curious child, but now her curiosity was driven by a deep need to understand her situation. After breakfast, she found Mrs. Thompson in the small study, typing on her laptop with a furrowed brow. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlotte said, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped behind her back in the formal pose she had been taught for official occasions. "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to give me a real answer." Mrs. Thompson looked up from her computer, surprised by the formal tone in Charlotte's voice. "Of course, Princess. What would you like to know?" Charlotte entered the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, sitting up straight the way she had been taught. "How long have we been here?" 3 days, Mrs. Thompson replied, though she seemed puzzled by the obvious question. "And how long did they originally think we would need to stay?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated, and Charlotte could see her weighing how much truth to reveal. Initially, they hoped it would only be a day or two. "But it's been longer than that, and we still don't have a date to go home," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger. "And yesterday when you were on the phone, I heard you say something about additional complications. What does that mean?" Mrs. Thompson closed her laptop and looked at Charlotte with new respect. "You're very observant, Princess." "I'm not stupid," Charlotte said firmly. "I know when adults are hiding things from me, and I know that whatever happened at the castle was worse than just some people walking in to make a point." For a long moment, Mrs. Thompson sat in silence, clearly struggling with how much to reveal to a 9-year-old. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "You're right, Charlotte. There have been some additional complications." Charlotte felt her heart begin to race, but she forced herself to remain calm and attentive. "What kind of complications?" "The people who entered the castle weren't just making a symbolic protest," Mrs. Thompson explained carefully. "They had detailed knowledge of the castle's layout and security procedures, knowledge they shouldn't have had." Charlotte felt cold despite the warm morning sunshine streaming through the window. "You mean someone helped them?" "Someone who works at the castle? That's what the security team is investigating. Until they can identify how these people got their information, they can't be completely sure that other locations might not be compromised as well." The full implication of this hit Charlotte like a physical blow. "You mean we can't go home because they don't know if home is safe anymore?" Mrs. Thompson nodded sadly. "They're working very hard to solve this problem, but it's taking longer than anyone hoped." Charlotte stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful countryside that had become her prison. "What about my parents? Are they in danger too?" "Your parents are in a secure location just like you are. But they're also working with the security teams and government officials to address this situation. It's their responsibility to handle these kinds of crises." "Without me," Charlotte said quietly, "it wasn't a question. Your safety is their top priority," Mrs. Thompson said gently. "Sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions to protect their children." Charlotte turned back to face her governess, and Mrs. Thompson was startled to see how much older she looked than she had just 3 days earlier. The innocence and carefree nature that had characterized Charlotte's childhood seemed to be slipping away in real time. Mrs. Thompson, do you think our lives will ever be the same again? The question was so mature and perceptive that Mrs. Thompson felt her own eyes fill with tears. I think your life will be different, but that doesn't mean it will be worse. Sometimes when difficult things happen, we learn how strong we really are. Charlotte spent the rest of the morning in the garden, sitting by the small pond and thinking about everything she had learned. She watched the fish swimming in lazy circles, their world contained and safe but limited. She wondered if that was what her life would be like from now on, protected but constrained. Mrs. Baker found her there at lunchtime, sitting on a wooden bench with her chin in her hands. Penny for your thoughts, Princess. Charlotte looked up at the kind woman who had become such a comfort during these strange days. Mrs. Baker, do you think I'll ever be able to do normal things? Like go to a regular school or walk through a village without guards watching me? Mrs. Baker sat down beside her on the bench. What would you like to do that you can't do now? Charlotte thought for a moment. I'd like to go into a shop by myself and buy something with my own money. I'd like to make friends who don't know I'm a princess first. I'd like to ride my bicycle somewhere without someone following me. Those sound like wonderful things to want, Mrs. Baker said thoughtfully. Maybe this situation, as difficult as it is, might help your parents understand how important those experiences could be for you. Do you really think so? I think your parents love you very much, and this whole experience has probably reminded them that your happiness is more important than following every single royal tradition. That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received a phone call that lasted much longer than usual. Charlotte tried not to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help noticing that the conversation seemed more positive than the previous ones had been. When Mrs. Thompson finally emerged from the study, she looked cautiously optimistic. Charlotte, I have some news, she announced. The security team has made significant progress in their investigation. They've identified the source of the information leak and taken steps to address it. Charlotte felt her heart leap with hope. Does that mean we can go home? Not immediately, Mrs. Thompson said carefully. But it does mean they're developing a plan for your safe return. It might still be several more days, but we finally have reason to believe this situation will be resolved soon. For the first time since arriving at Meadowbrook House, Charlotte felt genuinely hopeful. She still had many questions about what their life would look like after this experience. But the possibility of seeing her parents again made everything else seem manageable. That evening, as she sat by her bedroom window looking out at the stars that seemed so much brighter here than they ever had at the castle, Charlotte realized something important. These days of uncertainty and fear had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer the sheltered child who had taken comfort in the unchanging routine of the Royal Guard's morning march. She was someone who had faced real fear and found the strength to keep asking questions, even when the answers were frightening. Whatever came next, she knew she would never again be content to simply accept that things were done a certain way just because they had always been done that way. The traditions that had once felt like comfort now felt like walls, and Charlotte was beginning to understand that sometimes walls needed to be broken down to let in the light. On the 6th day at Meadowbrook House, Charlotte woke to the sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel drive. Her heart immediately began racing as she thought about all the possibilities. Were they finally going home? Or was this another emergency that would uproot her again? She rushed to the window and saw 2 black cars pulling up to the house, followed by a vehicle she didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson was already hurrying across the courtyard to meet whoever was arriving, her expression a mixture of relief and nervous energy. Charlotte quickly dressed and ran downstairs, where she found Mrs. Baker tidying the sitting room with unusual urgency. Mrs. Baker, what's happening? Are we leaving? Before Mrs. Baker could answer, the front door opened and Charlotte heard a voice that made her freeze in disbelief. Charlotte? Where's my brave girl? Mummy. Charlotte screamed, running toward the entrance hall so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet. The Duchess of Cambridge stood in the doorway, looking tired but radiant with joy at seeing her daughter. Charlotte threw herself into her mother's arms with such force that they both nearly fell backward. I missed you so much. Charlotte sobbed into her mother's shoulder. I was so scared, and no one would tell me when I could come home. And I thought maybe something terrible had happened to you and Papa. The Duchess held her daughter tightly, tears streaming down her own face. I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm here and everything is going to be all right. After several minutes of holding each other, Charlotte pulled back to look at her mother's face. "Where's Papa? Is he safe?"
Papa is safe, the Duchess assured her.
"He's back at the castle working with the security teams to make sure everything is properly taken care of. But he sends all his love and you'll see him very soon." Charlotte noticed that her mother looked different, older somehow, with worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before.
Mummy, were you scared too?
The Duchess cupped Charlotte's face in her hands. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Not for myself, but because I couldn't be with you when you needed me. That was the worst part of all of this." Mrs. Thompson appeared with tea, and they all sat together in the cozy sitting room where Charlotte had spent so many anxious hours over the past week. For a few minutes, they simply enjoyed being together. But Charlotte could see that her mother had something important to discuss. "Charlotte," the Duchess began carefully, "I need to talk to you about what happens next. The immediate danger is over, and the people responsible have been arrested. But this experience has taught us some important things about how we need to do things differently." Charlotte felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "What kind of differently?" "Well, for one thing, we're going to make some changes to the security arrangements at the castle. But more importantly, we want to make some changes to give you more of the normal childhood experiences you deserve." Charlotte looked at her mother with surprise. "You mean like going to a regular school?" The Duchess smiled. "Exactly like that. Your father and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to experience more of the world outside royal protocol. We want you to make friends who know you as Charlotte first, not as a princess." "Really?" Charlotte could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You mean I could go to school with other children and not have to worry about curtsying and formal dinners all the time?" "Within reason, yes," her mother laughed. "You'll still have some royal duties as you get older, but we want to make sure you have choices about how much of your life revolves around being royal." Charlotte thought about this for a moment. "Is this because of what happened at the castle? Because those people didn't like us being royal?" The Duchess's expression grew more serious. "Partly, yes. This experience reminded us that being royal comes with real risks. But it also showed us how isolated you've been from the regular world. We don't want you to grow up afraid of people who might disagree with the monarchy. But we also want you to understand different perspectives." "What if I decide I don't want to be royal when I grow up?" Charlotte asked, the question that had been forming in her mind finally emerging. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking carefully about her answer. "That would be your choice to make when you're old enough to understand all the implications. Right now you're still my little girl, and my job is to make sure you have enough experiences to make informed decisions about your future." Charlotte felt an enormous weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, the future felt like something she could help shape, rather than something that had already been decided for her. "Can we go home today?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," the Duchess replied. "I wanted to spend one night here with you, just the two of us, so we could talk about everything that's happened." That afternoon, Charlotte took her mother on a tour of the countryside around Meadowbrook House, showing her the pond where she had done so much thinking, and the meadow where she had watched sheep and wondered about normal children's lives. It felt strange to be the one showing her mother around, rather than the other way around. "Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Thompson took very good care of me," Charlotte told her mother as they walked along the stream. "But I was so lonely for you and Papa." "We were lonely for you too," the Duchess said, squeezing Charlotte's hand. "But I'm proud of how brave you were. Mrs. Thompson told me you asked very mature questions and handled everything with real dignity." "I was scared most of the time," Charlotte admitted. "But I kept thinking about what you would want me to do." "Fear doesn't make you less brave, Charlotte. Bravery is doing what needs to be done even when you're frightened." That evening, Charlotte, her mother, and Mrs. Thompson had dinner together in Mrs. Baker's cozy kitchen, rather than in the formal dining room. Charlotte couldn't remember ever seeing her mother eat in a kitchen before, and there was something wonderfully normal about sharing a simple meal around a scrubbed wooden table. "Mummy," Charlotte said as Mrs. Baker served them homemade soup and fresh bread, "when we go back to the castle, will the guards still do their morning march?" "Yes, they will," the Duchess replied. "Some traditions will continue because they serve important purposes. But other traditions might change to give you more freedom." "Good," Charlotte said firmly. "I like the guards' march. It makes me feel safe. But I want to choose which traditions to keep and which ones to change." Her mother smiled at her daughter's newfound confidence. "I think that sounds very wise." As they prepared for bed that night, Charlotte felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about returning to the castle. She was eager to see her father and to sleep in her own bed again, but she was also apprehensive about how different everything might feel after this experience. "Mummy," she said as her mother tucked her into the unfamiliar bed one last time, "do you think the castle will feel like home again?" The Duchess considered the question seriously. "It might feel different at first," she said honestly. "But home isn't really about the building, Charlotte. Home is about the people who love you and the feeling of being safe and accepted for who you are. Then I think home can be anywhere we're together," Charlotte said sleepily, as her mother kissed her goodnight and turned out the light. Charlotte felt genuinely peaceful for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. Tomorrow she would return to her old life, but she would be bringing her new understanding with her. She was no longer just a princess who happened to be a little girl. She was a little girl who happened to be a princess, and that distinction felt like the most important thing she had ever learned. The drive back to Windsor Castle felt both endless and too short at the same time. Charlotte sat between her mother and Mrs. Thompson in the back seat, watching familiar landmarks come into view as they got closer to home. Her stomach was filled with butterflies as she wondered what she would find when they arrived. "Will Papa be there when we get home?" Charlotte asked for the third time during the journey. "Yes, sweetheart," her mother assured her patiently. "He's waiting for you right now." As they turned down the long drive leading to the castle, Charlotte pressed her face to the window. Everything looked exactly the same from the outside. The same imposing stone walls, the same carefully maintained gardens, the same flags flying in the breeze. But Charlotte felt like a completely different person than the one who had left a week ago. The car pulled up to a side entrance rather than the main gate, and Charlotte could see several security personnel positioned around the area. They were being much more careful about who had access to the castle now, and Charlotte found their vigilance both reassuring and sobering. Her father was waiting just inside the door, and Charlotte ran to him with the same desperate energy she had shown when seeing her mother. Prince William swept her up in his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. "My brave princess," he murmured into her hair. "I've missed you more than you'll ever know." "Papa, I was so scared," Charlotte whispered. "But I tried to be brave like you would want me to be." "You were incredibly brave," he assured her, setting her down but keeping his hands on her shoulders. "Mrs. Thompson told us how maturely you handled everything. We're very proud of you." Charlotte looked around the familiar entrance hall, noting the subtle changes that had been made during her absence. There were new security cameras in corners she had never noticed before, and she could see additional locks on doors that had never needed them. "Is it safe now?" she asked quietly. "Much safer," her father confirmed. "We've learned a lot about how to better protect our home and our family. But Charlotte, I want you to know that you never have to be afraid to ask questions or express concerns about your safety. Your feelings matter to us." As they walked through the corridors toward the family's private quarters, Charlotte noticed more changes. Some staff members she didn't recognize, additional security checkpoints, and a general sense of heightened awareness that hadn't been there before. "Papa," she said as they climbed the familiar staircase to her room, "Mummy told me that some things are going to be different now. Not just the security things, but other things too." Prince William nodded. "That's right. Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking this week about what kind of life we want you to have. We realize that we've been so focused on preparing you for royal duties that we haven't given you enough opportunities to just be a child." They reached Charlotte's room, and she was relieved to see that nothing had been changed here. Her bed was made with the same coverlet, her books were arranged on the same shelves, and her favorite stuffed animals were waiting exactly where she had left them. "Can I really go to a regular school?" Charlotte asked, sitting on her bed and looking up at both her parents. "We're exploring options," her mother said, sitting beside her. "There are some excellent schools nearby where you could have a more normal experience while still maintaining your security." "What about friends? Could I have friends over without it being a formal state occasion?" Her father laughed. "Absolutely. In fact, we think it's very important for you to have friendships that aren't based on protocol and ceremony." Charlotte felt a surge of excitement, but also a touch of anxiety. "Will I still have to do royal things? State dinners and official ceremonies?" "Some, yes," her mother replied honestly. "You're still a princess, and that comes with certain responsibilities. But we want to balance those responsibilities with opportunities for you to experience life as a regular child. What made you decide to change things? Charlotte asked, curious about her parents' thinking. Her father sat on the other side of her bed. Several things, actually. This security incident showed us how isolated you've been from the real world. But more importantly, seeing how scared and confused you were this week made us realize that we need to prepare you for life, not just for royal duties. Plus, her mother added, you handled this crisis with such maturity and courage that we realized you're capable of much more independence than we've been giving you credit for. Charlotte thought about everything that had happened over the past week, the fear, the uncertainty, the conversations with Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Baker that had opened her eyes to different ways of thinking about her life and her future. I want to try going to regular school, she said firmly, and I want to make friends who don't know I'm a princess at first. But I also want to keep some of the royal traditions like the Guards' morning march. That makes me feel safe. That sounds like a perfect balance, her father agreed. You get to choose which traditions feel meaningful to you and which ones feel like unnecessary restrictions. As her parents left her to settle back into her room, Charlotte went to her familiar window and looked out at the courtyard below. It was nearly 7 o'clock and she could see the royal guard preparing for their evening inspection. The sight of their orderly formation no longer represented the rigid structure of her entire life. Now it simply represented one comforting element in what could be a much more varied and interesting existence. Mrs. Thompson knocked and entered, with a cup of Charlotte's favorite tea. How does it feel to be home, Princess? Different, Charlotte replied honestly. Good different, though. Like maybe home can be a place where I'm safe but also free to grow. I think that's exactly what home should be, Mrs. Thompson agreed. That evening, Charlotte had dinner with her parents in their private dining room rather than the formal state dining room. They talked about her week at Meadowbrook House, about her fears and discoveries, and about the plans they were making for her future. I learned something important while I was away, Charlotte told them as they shared dessert. I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going even when you are scared. Her parents exchanged a meaningful look across the table. That's a very mature insight, her mother said. Where did you learn that? From Mrs. Baker, and from thinking about everything that happened. Also from realizing that I could ask hard questions even when I was afraid of the answers. Speaking of hard questions, her father said gently, is there anything else you want to know about what happened or about what comes next? Charlotte considered this. I want to know more about why those people didn't like us being royal. Not because I'm angry at them, but because I want to understand different points of view. Her parents seemed surprised but pleased by this request. We think that's a wonderful attitude, her mother said. Understanding different perspectives will make you a better person and eventually a better royal if you choose to continue in that role. As Charlotte prepared for bed in her own familiar bathroom, brushing her teeth with her own toothbrush and putting on her own pajamas, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. She was still a princess, still lived in a castle, and still had royal guards marching outside her window. But now she also had the promise of choices, of experiences beyond the castle walls, and of a future she could help shape. The last thing she did before going to sleep was to write a thank you note to Mrs. Baker, expressing her gratitude for the kindness and wisdom she had shown during such a difficult time. As she sealed the envelope, Charlotte realized that this simple act of writing a personal note to someone who had cared for her represented exactly the kind of normal human connection she wanted more of in her. As she fell asleep that night to the familiar sounds of the castle settling around her, but with dreams full of new possibilities rather than rigid traditions. 6 months later, Charlotte stood at her bedroom window watching the Royal Guard's morning inspection. But this time she wasn't alone. Her new friend Sophie, whom she had met at Millfield Preparatory School, stood beside her with wide eyes, clearly amazed by the ceremony below. Do they really do this every single day? Sophie whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the guard's precision. Every day at 7 o'clock, Charlotte confirmed, but her tone was matter-of-fact rather than reverent. It's one of the traditions I decided to keep appreciating. The past 6 months had brought more changes to Charlotte's life than the previous 9 years combined. She now attended Millfield Prep 3 days a week, where she was known simply as Charlotte Wales to her classmates. The other 2 days were reserved for private tutoring and royal education, but even those sessions had been modified to include more practical life skills and current events. "Charlotte," Sophie said, turning away from the window, "can I ask you something that might sound rude?" Charlotte had learned to appreciate Sophie's direct nature, so different from the careful, deferential way most adults spoke to her. "Of course. We promised to always be honest with each other, remember? Don't you ever feel weird about having so much when other people have so little? Like you live in an actual castle while some kids don't even have proper houses." It was exactly the kind of question that Charlotte had hoped her new friendships would bring into her life. At school, she was learning about social issues, environmental problems, and economic inequality in ways that her previous education had never addressed. "I think about it a lot." "Actually," Charlotte replied thoughtfully, "that's part of why I want to understand how the world really works. If I'm going to be royal when I grow up, I want to use that position to help people, not just to attend fancy parties." Sophie grinned. "That's why I like you. You're not what I expected a princess to be like." "What did you expect?" "Someone spoiled and out of touch, I guess. But you're just normal, except for the castle and the guards and the occasional curtsy lessons." Charlotte laughed. "Trust me, 6 months ago I probably was exactly what you expected. This whole experience of being friends with you and the others at school has taught me more about real life than years of formal education." Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway, smiling at the sight of the two girls chatting so naturally. "Good morning, Sophie. I hope you slept well in the guest room." "Like a dream, Mrs. Thompson, though I have to admit it's a bit surreal waking up in a castle." "You'll get used to it," Mrs. Thompson said with a wink. "Charlotte, your mother would like to see you both before breakfast. She has something special planned for today." As they walked through the corridors toward the family quarters, Charlotte noticed how much more comfortable she felt in her own home now. The changes in her life had somehow made the castle feel less like a museum and more like an actual residence. They found the Duchess in the morning room, reviewing some documents with a man Charlotte didn't recognize. When she saw the girls approaching, she set aside her papers and smiled warmly. "Good morning, both of you. Sophie, I hope Charlotte has been a good hostess during your first sleepover here." "The best," Sophie assured her. "Though I'm still getting used to having someone serve me breakfast in bed." The Duchess laughed. "Well, today we're going to do something quite different. I wanted to show you both one of the projects that's become very important to our family since Charlotte's experience earlier this year." The man with the documents stood up as they approached. "Girls, I'd like you to meet Mr. Harrison. He runs a charity that helps families who are going through security crises, people who have had to leave their homes suddenly because of threats or violence." Charlotte felt a jolt of recognition. "You mean like what happened to me, but for regular families?" "Exactly like that," Mr. Harrison confirmed. "Families who have to flee domestic violence or people who have been threatened because of their jobs or beliefs. We help them find safe temporary housing and support while they rebuild their lives." Sophie looked between Charlotte and her mother with growing understanding. "And you support this charity because of what Charlotte went through?" "It was Charlotte's idea, actually," the Duchess explained proudly. "A few months ago, she asked me what we could do to help other people who might be going through the same fear and displacement she experienced." Charlotte blushed slightly. "I kept thinking about how scared I was and how lucky I was to have Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Baker taking care of me. But what happens to children who don't have anyone to make sure they're safe and comfortable?" Mr. Harrison pulled out a tablet and showed them photos of families the charity had helped. "We've been able to house 43 families in the past 6 months, including 16 children around your age, Charlotte." As they looked through the photos, Sophie grabbed Charlotte's arm. "This is amazing. You're actually using your experience to help other people. We're planning to visit one of the safe houses this afternoon," the Duchess announced. "If you girls are interested, you could meet some of the families and see how the charity works." Charlotte felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, but this time it was excitement rather than fear. "Can we really do that? Would it be safe?" "Completely safe," Mr. Harrison assured her. "And the families know you're coming. Some of the children are quite excited to meet you." That afternoon, Charlotte found herself in a situation that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. She and Sophie were sitting in a comfortable but modest living room, playing board games with 3 children whose families had been forced to leave their homes due to various threats. 8-year-old Marcus had been displaced when his mother, a social worker, received serious threats from someone she had reported for child abuse. 10-year-old Aisha and her little brother Kai were staying at the safe house while their father, a journalist, completed an assignment that had put the family at risk. Were you really scared when you had to leave your castle? Aisha asked Charlotte as they played a card game. Terrified, Charlotte admitted. I cried a lot and I kept asking when I could go home. Did you know why you had to leave right away? Marcus wanted to know, not at first. The adults tried to protect me by not telling me everything, but that actually made it worse because I imagined all sorts of terrible things. Sophie listened to this conversation with fascination, watching Charlotte relate to these children with genuine empathy and understanding. The worst part, Charlotte continued, was not knowing when I would see my parents again. Even though I was safe and people were taking good care of me, I felt so lonely. Kai, who was only 6, looked up from his coloring book. I miss my room and my toys. I know exactly how that feels, Charlotte said gently. When I was staying away from home, I missed my bed and my stuffed animals so much. But you know what I learned? What? All 3 children asked at once. I learned that home isn't really about the place or the things. Home is about feeling safe and loved. And right now, this place is keeping you safe. And your parents love you just as much here as they did in your old house. The afternoon flew by as Charlotte and Sophie played games, helped with homework, and listened to the stories of these resilient children who were facing challenges far more serious than anything Charlotte had experienced. On the drive back to the castle, Sophie was unusually quiet. Finally, she turned to Charlotte. You know what's amazing about today? What? Those kids didn't care that you're a princess. They just cared that you understood what they were going through. You connected with them because of your experience, not because of your title. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what I want my life to be about. Using whatever advantages I have to help people, rather than just enjoying privileges because I was born into them. That evening, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she reflected on how dramatically her perspective had changed since that frightening morning when the Royal Guard's routine had been shattered. The security breach that had seemed like such a disaster had actually opened up a world of possibilities she never could have imagined. She still lived in a castle, still had royal guards, and still attended state functions when required. But now she also had real friends, attended regular school, and was beginning to understand how she might use her position to make a positive difference in the world. As she looked out her window at the guards taking their evening positions, Charlotte no longer saw them as symbols of rigid tradition that confined her life. Instead, she saw them as one element of security in a life that was now rich with choices and opportunities. The tearful princess, who had once called for the royal guard in panic, had grown into a young woman who understood that true strength came not from the protection of others, but from the courage to venture beyond those protections when there was important work to be done. Charlotte fell asleep that night not to the sound of tradition, but to the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her life had purpose beyond protocol, and that the most important royal duty of all was simply being human enough to understand and help others who were struggling. The next morning, she would wake up not as a princess who happened to be a little girl, but as a little girl who was learning how to be the kind of princess the world actually needed.